This is not a diplomatic victory. It is a hostile takeover. What happened in the Caribbean Sea under the cover of Operation Absolute Resolve was not a restoration of democracy, but a seizure of assets. When the President of the United States stood before the cameras and declared, "We are in charge," he was not speaking metaphorically about the political transition in Caracas. He was speaking literally about the oil fields, the refineries, and the sovereign wealth of a nation that has effectively become a ward of the American executive branch. And this distinction matters because it changes the nature of the conflict entirely. We are no longer witnessing a foreign policy dispute. We are witnessing the first corporate acquisition of a foreign state in modern history. And the reason this moment feels so heavy in Washington is not because Nicolás Maduro is sitting in a cell at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn. Few tears are being shed for a dictator who starved his own people. The heaviness comes from the realization that the mechanism used to put him there, a unilateral military extraction, followed by an immediate declaration of emergency powers over economic resources, has shattered the guardrails that were Bataway, supposed to contain executive ambition. Because once you establish the precedent that a president can seize a country first and ask Congress for permission later, you have not just expanded the presidency, you have uncorked it. And that is why the phones are lighting up across Capitol Hill this morning. Not with celebration, but with panic. And this panic is not partisan. It is structural. For the first time in this administration, the pushback is not coming from the opposition party, which has been reduced to a spectator sport, but from the Republicans themselves. Senators who spent the last year rationalizing every executive order are now looking at the map of Venezuela and realizing that the emergency declared to manage its oil assets is actually a tool to bypass their own oversight. They understand that the declaration of a national emergency tied to Venezuelan oil is not about national security. It is about money. It is about creating a legal framework where multinational energy companies can step in and monetize the chaos without the interference of legislative review. But the administration knows exactly what it is doing. By framing this as a crisis of stability, they have activated the extraordinary powers that lie dormant in the American legal code, waiting for a president bold enough to use them. And Donald Trump has never lacked for boldness. He understands that in the current media environment, complexity is a liability. So he has simplified the narrative into a binary choice. You are either with him and the restoration of order, or you are with the socialists and the chaos. It is a brutal political calculus, and it is working on the public, but it is failing in the Senate cloakroom. Because the men and women who write the checks for these operations know that order imposed by executive fiat is just another word for dictatorship. And that is why the War Powers Act has suddenly become the most important document in Washington. It is no longer an abstract debate for constitutional scholars. It is the emergency brake. And Republicans are reaching for it because they see where this train is heading. They see a president who processes geopolitics not as a system of alliances, but as a series of real estate deals. To him, Venezuela is not a country with a complex history and a dual presidency crisis involving Delcy Rodriguez. It is a distressed asset, and like any distressed asset, he believes it can be flipped for a profit if you control the management. That mindset might work in a boardroom in Manhattan. But when applied to a sovereign nation with a military and a population of millions, it invites a catastrophe that no amount of oil revenue can fix. And this brings us to the uncomfortable truth that no one wants to say out loud. The benefits of this intervention, the stabilized oil prices, the contracts for American firms, the projection of strength will not flow to the ordinary family in Ohio or the small business owner in Georgia. They will flow to the corporate giants that have been quietly lobbying for this outcome for years. The emergency is a transfer of wealth disguised as a humanitarian mission. And the Republicans who are quietly moving to block these powers are not doing it because they love Maduro. They are doing it because they fear that if they let this slide, The next distressed asset might be something closer to home. They are asking themselves a question that would have been unthinkable 2 years ago. If the president can declare an emergency to seize control of a foreign economy, what stops him from declaring an emergency to seize control of a domestic one? And that question is the friction point. It is the sand in the gears of what was supposed to be a victory lap for the second term. Instead of unity, we have a fracture. Instead of a party falling in line, we have a party looking for the exit. Because they know that Operation Absolute Resolve was not just a military operation, it was a test. A test of whether the American system of checks and balances still functions when the pressure comes from the very top. And right now, the system is blinking red. The declaration of emergency powers has bypassed the legislative process so completely that Congress has been rendered irrelevant. And for a senator, irrelevance is a fate worse than death. That is why you are seeing the leaks, the whispered concerns, and the sudden interest in oversight from lawmakers who have spent a career avoiding it. But there is another layer to this, one that is even colder. The administration is banking on the fact that the American public is too exhausted to care about the procedural nuances of the War Powers Act. They are betting that as long as gas prices tick down and the images on television show American strength, voters will forgive the erosion of constitutional norms, and they might be right. But history suggests that this is a dangerous gamble, because power that is justified only by results is fragile. If the occupation of the Venezuelan oil sector turns into a quagmire, if the promised stability turns into an insurgency, the justification evaporates, and what you are left with is just the naked exercise of force. And force, without the legitimacy of law, is brittle. It snaps, and we are already seeing the stress fractures. The reports coming out of Caracas regarding the dual presidency, one leader in a Brooklyn jail cell, another swearing in at the Miraflores Palace, create a legal nightmare that will tie up American courts for a decade. Who owns the rights to the oil? Who signs the contracts? Who is the sovereign? The administration's answer is simple: we are. But the world does not work that way. International law does not work that way. And by ignoring these complexities, the White House is walking into a trap of its own making. They have bought the cow, but they have no idea how to milk it without getting kicked. And the Republicans in the Senate know this. They know that they will be the ones left holding the bag when the bill comes due. Which is why this revolt is happening now. It is an act of self-preservation. These senators are looking at the polls. They are looking at the anger in their districts. And they are calculating the cost of loyalty. They are realizing that blind allegiance to a president who views the law as a suggestion is a suicide pact. And they are deciding, slowly but surely, that they want to live. So they are using the only tools they have left: the committee hearings, the budget writers, the slow walking of confirmations. It is not a glamorous resistance. It is a bureaucratic one. But in Washington, bureaucracy is where dreams go to die. And right now, the Republican establishment is trying to kill the dream of an imperial presidency before it becomes a permanent reality. And do not mistake their silence for consent. The lack of public screaming matches does not mean there is peace. It means the war has moved underground. It has moved into the details of the appropriations bills and the fine print of the oversight demands. This is where the real battle for the soul of the American government is being fought. Not on the campaign trail, but in the markup sessions where the flow of money is controlled. Because eventually, even a president who claims to be in charge of everything needs to pay the bills, and Congress still holds the purse strings. For now. And that brings us back to the oil. The black gold that is supposedly the prize of this entire venture. The administration promises that this wealth will be used to rebuild Venezuela and protect American interests. But we have heard promises like this before. We heard them in Iraq. We heard them in Libya. And every time, the wealth seems to evaporate into a mist of contractors. consultants, and corruption. The emergency becomes permanent. The temporary powers become standard operating procedure. And the American people are left with the debt and the moral stain of intervention. This is the pattern. This is the architecture of the modern American empire. And Donald Trump has not disrupted this architecture. He has simply stripped away the polite facade and exposed the raw machinery underneath. And that exposure is what terrifies the establishment. They prefer their imperialism with a side of moralizing. They want to believe that we are the good guys, spreading freedom and democracy. But when you arrest a foreign leader and claim his country's resources in the same breath, you make it very hard to maintain that illusion. You force everyone to look in the mirror and see the ruthlessness that underpins the system. And that is an uncomfortable sight. It is easier to look away. It is easier to focus on the drama of the arrest or the spectacle of the press conference. But if you want to understand what is really happening, you have to look at the contracts. You have to look at who is getting the rights to drill, who is getting the rights to ship, and who is getting the rights to secure the fields. Because in the end, this is not about Nicolás Maduro. He is just a prop in a much larger play. This is about establishing a new rule for the 21st century, that sovereignty is conditional, that if you have something we need and you refuse to play ball, we will not just sanction you, we will not just isolate you, we will come and take it, and we will call it a rescue. This is the message being sent to every capital in the world today, from Riyadh to Moscow to Beijing, and you can be sure that they are listening. They are taking notes, and they are adjusting their own calculations accordingly. The era of the rules-based international order was already dying. Operation Absolute Resolve just put the final nail in the coffin. And for the American citizen watching this unfold on their screen, the question is simple. Do you feel safer? Do you feel more prosperous? Or do you feel like you are watching a high-stakes gambling match where your country is the chip? Because that is exactly what is happening. The president is betting the credibility of the United States on a long-shot bid to control the energy market. If he wins, he cements his power. If he loses, the consequences will not fall on him. They will fall on you, on your currency, on your standing in the world, and on the sons and daughters who will be sent to guard those oil fields when the inevitable insurgency begins. This is the reality of the emergency. It is a suspension of democracy in the name of profit. It is a bypass of the Constitution in the name of efficiency. And it is a betrayal of the very principles that are supposed to make America different from the regimes we claim to oppose. The Republicans in the Senate see this. The question is whether they have the courage to stop it, or if they will simply negotiate a better cut of the proceeds. Because right now, the only thing standing between the president and absolute control is a handful of lawmakers who are remembering, perhaps too late, that they took an oath to the Constitution, not to the deal. And if you think this is unprecedented, if you think this is a unique aberration born from the mind of Donald Trump, you are not looking far enough back. You are looking at the headlines of today when you should be looking at the history books of the last century. Because we have seen this movie before. We saw it in 1989, when American troops descended on Panama City, blasted rock music at the papal nunciature, and dragged Manuel Noriega to a cell in Miami. That was the dress rehearsal. That was the proof of concept. The argument then was the same as the argument now, a restoration of order, a removal of a criminal element, a necessary intervention for the safety of the hemisphere. But there is a critical difference between Panama in 1989 and Venezuela in 2026. Panama was a transit hub. Venezuela is a gas station. And when you seize a gas station, you do not just change the management. You take ownership of the volatile, flammable liquid underneath. And this shift from political intervention to economic acquisition marks a return to an older, darker form of statecraft. It is not the neoliberal interventionism of the 1990s. which sought to build democracies. It is the mercantile imperialism of the 19th century, which sought to secure resources. We are not building nations anymore. We are foreclosing on them. And the legal mechanism being used to justify this foreclosure, the declaration of a national emergency to bypass the legislative branch, is exactly how the Roman Republic slowly suffocated itself. It was not destroyed by a foreign enemy. It was destroyed by a series of necessary emergencies that concentrated power in the hands of a single consul until the Senate became nothing more than a debating society for wealthy spectators. And that is the historical echo that is keeping constitutional scholars awake at night. They understand that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the tool the president is currently wielding like a blunt instrument, was designed to freeze assets of terrorists, not to run the oil industry of a sovereign nation. By stretching this statute to cover the takeover of Petróleos de Venezuela, the administration is effectively rewriting the law without a single vote being cast in Congress. They are creating a new branch of government, an economic proconsulship that answers only to the Oval Office. And once that door is opened, it does not close. If a president can seize a foreign oil company because it is destabilizing, what stops a future president from seizing a domestic tech company because it is misinformation? The logic is identical. The only difference is the geography. And this brings us to the friction that is grinding inside the Pentagon. The generals and admirals who are tasked with executing Operation Absolute Resolve are not politicians. They are logisticians. And they look at the map of Venezuela and they do not see a real estate deal. They see a nightmare. They know that occupying the oil fields is the easy part. Holding them is the hard part. Because you cannot extract oil with a bayonet. You need engineers. You need workers. You need infrastructure. And right now, the infrastructure of Venezuela is rotting, and the workers are hostile. By declaring we are in charge, the president has made the United States military the de facto human resources department for a collapsing petro-state. And this is where the one country, two presidents problem transforms from a diplomatic curiosity into a strategic disaster. With Maduro in Brooklyn and Delcy Rodriguez in Caracas, the chain of command in Venezuela has not been decapitated, it has been bifurcated. Half the bureaucracy answers to the woman in the palace. The other half is waiting for orders from the Americans. This is not stability. This is administrative paralysis. And in an economy that runs entirely on the flow of oil, paralysis is fatal. The tankers are sitting in the harbor. The contracts are in limbo. The international insurers, the people who actually make global trade possible, are refusing to cover ships entering Venezuelan waters because they do not know who the legal government is. So instead of flowing to American markets to lower gas prices as promised, the oil is staying in the ground. And the irony is that this chaos is exactly what the administration claimed it was preventing. They promised clarity. They delivered confusion. They promised a quick resolution. They delivered a protracted legal and military quagmire. And this failure of competence is far more dangerous to the president than any moral argument. In Washington, you can survive being ruthless. You cannot survive being ineffective. And right now, the operation is looking less like a masterstroke of strength and more like a hostile takeover gone wrong. The ruthless architect is realizing that the building he bought is full of asbestos, and the demolition costs are going to be higher than the purchase price. And we must look at the silence of the international community, specifically our allies in Europe. Their silence is not approval. It is shock. They are watching a NATO member, the supposed leader of the free world, act with the unilateral aggression they usually associate with their adversaries. And this is breaking the transatlantic alliance in ways that tariffs and tweets never could, because alliances are built on shared expectations. And the expectation was that the United States respects the concept of sovereignty. By shattering that norm, by treating a neighbor as a resource colony, the administration is telling London, Paris, and Berlin that the rules have changed, that we are entering a post-legal world where the only law is the law of the strongest. And in that world, alliances are liabilities. And this connects directly to the wallet of every American watching this. Because when the rules of international trade are rewritten by force, the cost of doing business goes up. The risk premium on everything from shipping insurance to foreign investment spikes, and that premium is passed on to you. You pay for it at the pump. Not because of the price of crude, but because of the price of chaos. You pay for it in your 401k. Because the multinational companies you invest in are now operating in a world where their assets can be seized or frozen at the whim of a politician. The stability that made the American economy the envy of the world was built on the rule of law. When you replace the rule of law with the rule of man, you introduce a volatility that markets cannot price in. And that volatility is the enemy of prosperity. It creates an economy of short-term looting rather than long-term growth. It encourages the kind of crony capitalism where success depends on your proximity to the president, not on the quality of your product. We are seeing this already with the Board of Peace initiative, where diplomatic influence is being sold for $1 billion entry fee. This is the monetization of state power. It is the turning of the government into a vending machine where you put in money and get out policy. And if that model is applied to the occupation of Venezuela, we will see a gold rush of contractors and friends of the administration descending on Caracas to carve up the spoils, while the American taxpayer foots the bill for the security detail. And let us not forget the moral dimension, which the three cardinals so poignantly raised. It is easy to dismiss religious leaders in a secular age, but they are pointing out a structural truth. A nation that loses its moral compass eventually loses its ability to govern itself. If we accept that it is acceptable to kidnap a foreign leader and seize his country's assets because it serves our interests, we are accepting a definition of justice that is purely transactional. And transactional justice is no justice at all. It is just leverage. And if leverage is the only thing that matters, then there is no reason for the government to treat its own citizens any better than it treats the citizens of Venezuela. The habits of empire, always. Eventually, come home. And this is what the Republicans in the Senate are quietly realizing. They see the trajectory. They see the Roman precedent. They see that a republic cannot remain a republic if it behaves like an empire abroad. The two systems are incompatible. One relies on consent, the other relies on coercion. And you cannot be Dr. Jekyll at home and Mr. Hyde overseas forever. Eventually, the potion wears off. Eventually, the coercion starts to be applied to domestic enemies, to the press, to the judiciary, to the dissenting party members. We are seeing the early signs of this with the investigations into Senator Slotkin and Jerome Powell. The tools of foreign intervention are being repurposed for domestic control. And so, the historical echo becomes a deafening siren. We are not just repeating history, we are accelerating it. We are condensing the century-long decline of previous superpowers into a single presidential term. And the tragedy is that this was avoidable. There were other ways to deal with Maduro. There were other ways to secure energy independence. But those ways required patience. They required diplomacy. And they required a respect for complexity. And patience is not a virtue in this White House. Complexity is viewed as weakness. And so we chose the hammer. And now, looking at the shattered pieces of the Venezuelan state and the fracturing norms of our own, we are forced to ask, was it worth it? And as the sun sets on Washington today, the answer to that question is hanging in the heavy air. The emergency is not going away. It is becoming the new normal. The troops are digging in. The lawyers are billing their hours. And the oil is still underground. The only thing that has changed is that the United States has crossed a line that it drew for itself in 1945. We have traded the mantle of the liberator for the helmet of the occupier. And history teaches us that the helmet is heavy, and it blinds you to the dangers coming from your own periphery. And now we arrive at the uncomfortable question that no one in the White House press briefing room will answer. It is the question that defines the gap between the headlines you see and the reality you live. How does this end for you? Because the bill for empire always arrives. And it does not arrive at the Pentagon. It arrives at your kitchen table. When the administration bypasses Congress to fund Operation Absolute Resolve, they are not using magic money. They are using your future earnings. They are monetizing debt to secure oil that may never flow, creating a risk premium that is quietly embedded in the price of every gallon of milk and every kilowatt of electricity you consume. This is not just inflation. This is a tax on your stability imposed by a government that has decided its global ambitions matter more than your domestic security. And do not make the mistake of thinking that the emergency is a concept that stays overseas. The legal architecture being constructed to manage Venezuela is modular. It can be dismantled and reassembled right here at home. We are already seeing the blueprints. The investigation into Senator Alyssa Slotkin for sedition is not a random act of vengeance. It is a stress test. It is a probe to see if the public will accept the criminalization of political dissent. If the president can declare a national emergency to seize a foreign company because it threatens national security, what stops him from using the same statute to seize a domestic media company, or a tech firm, or a bank, under the exact same pretext? The answer, historically, has been the courts. But the courts are slow, and emergencies are fast. And this brings us to the binary choice that every American must face in 2026. You can no longer afford the luxury of neutrality. The friction in Washington has generated enough heat to burn down the fence you are sitting on. You must decide how you view the architecture of this new world. Are you a believer who thinks that this consolidation of power is temporary and benevolent, or are you a realist who understands that power, once seized, is never voluntarily returned? I want you to leave a comment below. Write believer if you trust the government to hand back these emergency powers when the crisis fades. Write realist if you believe they are building a permanent cage. Do not just watch. Go on the record. Because in 5 years, that comment will be a time capsule of your own judgment. And while you decide, I want you to take a specific action. I want you to open your wallet. Take out a $1 bill. Look at the top line. It says Federal Reserve Note. It is a promissory note. It is a piece of paper that relies entirely on the faith that the United States government is stable, rational, and bound by law. Now, ask yourself, after watching the seizure of a sovereign nation's assets, after watching the attack on the Federal Reserve Chairman, after watching the weaponization of the Justice Department, is that faith stronger or weaker than it was yesterday? If the answer is weaker, then you know what you must do. You must stop storing your labor in a currency that is being diluted by ambition. You must diversify into assets that cannot be printed, seized, or declared emergency property by an executive order. Because the system is not going to save you. The Republicans in the Senate are trying to pull the brakes. But the train has too much momentum. The ruthless architect is not building a bridge to the future. He is building a fortress for himself. And in a fortress, there are only two classes of people, the guards and the prisoners. The Free America walkout today is a sign that some people refuse to be either. They are trying to opt out. But you cannot opt out of an economy that surrounds you. You can only insulate yourself. You can only build your own walls of financial and intellectual independence before the state decides that your independence is also a national security threat. And so we end not with a conclusion, but with a warning. The events of this week, the Venezuelan seizure, the attack on the Fed, The revolt in Congress are not isolated incidents. They are the sound of the old republic cracking under the weight of a new empire. The noise is deafening, but do not let it distract you. Keep your eyes on the machinery. Watch the hands that move the money. And remember that in a world where the rules are being rewritten in real time, the most dangerous thing you can be is unprepared. The emergency is not coming. It is here, and it has your name on the invoice.